A simple tartan gown, a wedding from long, long ago. A family's history passed down from generation to generation. The Isabella MacTavish wedding gown is an iconic piece of Scottish history, and today we'll explore its origins, the woman and family it belonged to, its significance in Scottish and dress history, as well as its modern recreation. Clothing serves as the great connector to generations past. And by studying old clothing, it helps humanize and better understand our ancestors, their daily lives, their likes and dislikes, and the experiences that shaped their world. We all wear clothing. We all get dressed every morning 1 foot at a time. And while we might not all be kings, queens, or even blacksmiths and sailors, we all wear clothing. And it's the common thread that ties human history together. Hi, I'm Abby Cox, lead mantua-maker for the Isabella MacTavish Fraser wedding gown project. And by recreating this special tartan gown, we're going to be able to step into the buckled shoes of the woman who wore the gown, as well as the women who helped make this dress for her. As modern dress historians, by recreating this gown, we're going to be able to uncover all of its quirks and secrets long since forgotten. Its triumphs and its failures will be brought back to life during this 2-day dressmaking event. But before we dive into the recreation process itself, let's take a moment to learn about the history of the gown, Isabella MacTavish Fraser, and how it's become an iconic piece of Scottish history.
I stumbled across an image of this incredible tartan gown while researching to design my own wedding dress. It really struck something in the heart of me at about the same time that I had just discovered I did have a Scottish line of lineage myself, so it was especially important a personal way for me. As a historical dressmaker, it occurred to me quite quickly that this is something actually I could make. And that was the seed of the idea to start thinking about researching it to make a replica. In researching it, I discovered that so little was known about women's clothing, real women's clothing in the Highlands, like this black hole. I realized that this dress hadn't really been studied and brought out and recorded and shared with the public, and that was the seed for putting together a project that would not just be me making a replica in my own workshop, but doing it in a way that other people could see and really learn about this dress. And the more stories have poured in about how much this dress means to people all over the world, it just seems like the right time to share it. Isabella MacTavish grew up on a farm a little ways out of Inverness in the Highlands. In her mid-20s, she married Malcolm Fraser, who lived nearby. They actually got married in the town of Duchess, just a few miles away from the farm, and again a few miles away from Inverness. They got married in the middle of the winter, just after Christmas, in January 1785. In the history of this dress, after Isabella wore this for her wedding, there have been 3 more brides. Isabella's son Tavish, when he married Jane Fraser, she wore the dress. And then there was a long gap, and no one wore the dress that we know of until Isabel Beaton, the current owner, wore it herself for her wedding in 1978.
My name's Isabel Beaton, and I am the owner of the dress, which has now become known sort of as the Isabella MacTavish Fraser dress. In our family, I guess it was just called the Tartan wedding dress, but I'm getting used to calling it the Isabella MacTavish Fraser dress too. It belonged to my 3 times great-grandmother. I think now it's beginning to feel a bit of a responsibility to do the right thing about the dress. It's amazing. It's amazing. The other side is it's amazing. In fact, it's survived and gone on all the journeys when it must have gone, and to have ended up still existing is great.
We generally associate tartan with menswear, and that's what's so great about the Isabel MacTavish Fraser dress, because not much survives relating to tartan and women's clothing in the 18th century. We do know that women would have been wearing tartan. It stands to reason that skirts, petticoats, shawls, or arisades as they're called in the Highlands, these were definitely being worn. There's lots of visual evidence of arisades in particular, but this is why the MacTavish dress is so unusual, because it survives in its entirety, and that doesn't happen very often. And we are still left with this perception that tartan is more of a masculine thing, and that's why this dress is so important, because it shows that it wasn't always just being worn by men.
Since clothing up until the late 19th century was especially made for individuals by skilled tradesmen and women, by recreating their clothing, we were able to become intimate with the body that wore the gown and its maker. How tall were they? How short? Was there an old injury that caused them to walk a certain way? Were they left-handed or right-handed? How old were they when this garment was made? What problems did the dressmaker or tailor have when making this item? How did they solve the issue? When recreating an 18th century gown, whether from an original or taking inspiration from a painting or a book, one must always start with the correct materials.
In 18th century Scotland, the main fabrics that you have are linen, wool, and towards the end of the century you start to see cotton coming in. But for most of the population, most of their wardrobe would have been made from linen and wool. Standard perception might be that all of this would have been made within individual households, that you make your own cloth, you make your own clothing. And that would have been true to some extent, possibly in the rural areas. But the Highlands of Scotland were by no means cut off, and we know that there was a lot of cloth being brought in. Sometimes that cloth might have been brought in from somewhere like Edinburgh up to the north, or from abroad. As early as the 1720s, we know that there were families in Inverness who were buying in silk.
To be able to faithfully recreate the hard tartan used in the original dress, Rebecca set out to find a weaver who equaled her passion for the Highlands and Scottish history, as well as possessing the facilities and skill to reproduce the fabric.
Tartan in the Scottish context is both a fabric and a pattern. So as a fabric, it's traditionally woolen, but it can be made from many other fibres. It can be wool and silk, it could be cotton and wool, a mixture of all of them. And as a pattern, it's at its most basic form is a check. So to create a tartan, all you really need is 2 yarns of different colours, and the weaving pattern creates the check. The more colours you have, the more complex the check can be, and the more complex the tartan will be.
This leads to Prickly Thistle, a tartan weaving business located in the Scottish Highlands and owned by Claire Campbell. Claire's expertise in tartan weaving and antique looms meant that she was able to recreate the fabric. That's not to say reproducing the tartan was easy. In fact, it is impossible to create an exact reproduction. Changes in loom and weaving technology, breeds of sheep becoming extinct, and differences in commercial dyes all meant that a true reproduction would never be possible.
Colour is obviously very important in tartan, and there are theories that there's certain status or meaning associated with red in particular. Unlike today, we see a tartan and we associate it with a clan, and colours can even have meanings. In the 18th century, it wasn't really like that. It was more about how expensive the dyes were. That's what gave you status. So for the Isabella MacTavish Fraser tartan that's in the gown, there's a lot of red. Red was a high status colour because it was very expensive. In the 18th century, you could get cochineal imported, and we know that tartan manufacturers in Scotland were importing cochineal. So it wasn't just a cottage industry. It wasn't just something that people were using dyes and lichens from the hills and moss to create their own tartan. Certainly that was happening, but it was also a commercial enterprise, and you could import expensive dyes to create these really bright, vibrant colours.
Choices in construction were determined by a mix of thoughtfulness in working with the tartan and speed. Mistakes were made in this gown, and the fixes were done so well that the only way we could figure out that there had even been a mistake was recreating each section stitch by stitch and uncovering its secrets.
So before we went to Scotland, we decided that it was in everyone's best interests for us to do a test dress version of the Isabella MacTavish Fraser wedding gown. We only actually had photographs that other people took of the original gown.
We didn't really know quite what was going on, so we looked at those really, really closely and then tried to reproduce what we were seeing in the photographs.
What we found was a gown that was quickly made for a woman who would be considered extremely average in size today, which further explains how so many of her descendants were able to wear the gown for their own weddings with little to no alterations. The hard tartan fabric, unusual for a woman's gown in the 18th century, dictated most of the design choices. During the late 1780s, when this dress was thought to have been made, small pleats and pieced backs were all the rage, but the bold, broad tartan required broad back pleats, long out of fashion, winged cuffs, The only bits of decoration on this simple gown are severely outdated by the mid-1780s, but would have been fashionable for the 1740s. While there is no way to confirm whether this tartan gown worn by a girl long after the failed Jacobite rebellion was meant to be worn as a political statement or as a romantic one, it is difficult to overlook its stylistic similarities.
So what we realized very quickly that this gown is not made in a way that we like to make gowns.
It's very atypical. So we were looking at the photos and we're like, oh, well, that's an interesting construction. How fascinating. And then there were other parts of it that were like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do it that way? Mm-hmm. And it's what we get into when we do the making is, why did they do this?
Yeah.
Is this a mistake? How did they correct it?
One of the most interesting points of the construction process with this gown were actually the sleeves.
Oh, my favorite
Yeah.
part. I love the sleeves of this gown.
And something we noticed eventually in the making up of these sleeves is that there was a massive mistake made by the mantua-maker, where we hypothesized that she actually made the sleeve
Too tight.
too tight below the elbow, and
Isabella couldn't bend her arm to touch her nose or take a drink of water. So they made a quick fix, which was they actually got up in there and clipped into the crook of the arm so she could bend her arm. Mm-hmm. And then they covered all of that crazy business with the cuff.
part of our challenge was actually breaking that down, figuring out what happened, figuring out why that happened, and then figuring out how to fix it in a way that we were able to honor the cork in the gown and make it make sense in our reproduction of it. That, right, just looking at it, that's, even though I know that's what it is, it's throwing everything off.
Yes, I agree.
And then pleat it before you put it on the arm.
Yep. And then stick it on the arm.
Yeah, because right now, like, I can see the split hanging out too.
Yes.
So I think it needs
It's not in the right place.
It needs to be pleated, and it needs to have the seam allowance folded correctly.
This is too long. Then.
Potentially, yeah.
Because it's not going to be down here. We're here in Nevada. The gown's over there in Scotland.
And we're just looking at pictures as best as we can on Google Drive.
And we're trying to figure out the back pleats of this gown. I looked at the photos and I worked out the tartan set. Mm-hmm. And about approximately, based on the known quantities, the width of the individual panels, how wide the pattern in the tartan was. And then I printed it out on a piece of paper.
Yes.
And we tried to pleat this piece of paper, this tiny, like, 1/32 scale piece of paper,
Yeah.
to figure out how deep the back pleats were, because, of course, you can't get your fingers in there and measure any of that on the finished piece.
No, so we had like hardly any measurements to work with. We did 3 or 4 iterations of this back on paper and on our plain wool fabric, trying to figure out how this back went together, because we didn't have the whole story yet. It wasn't working. Luckily, Rebecca ended up sending us a sample piece of the tartan that we were going to end up using in Scotland, and that's when everything started to make a lot more sense.
The lines, the squares and the stripes on the tartan, we could see what was lining up with what from the photos, and once we had that piece of tartan, it very, very easily went together. There were still challenges though, especially with the back seam.
Yeah.
In an English gown, the back seam is angled, and it's what brings everything in. But on the original dress, that is offset. There's a little bit of a mistake there.
That's part of the challenge, is reproducing like the human nuances that are in this gown. So we're sitting here moving the seams like 1/32 of an inch. We're talking like fractions of millimeters here, trying to get it to look the way that they did it. Here though, and that was just the 1/2 inch folded over for the seam allowance.
Yeah.
So
That's about what I'd say.
The second time this recreation was undertaken was with a team of seamstresses from all over the United Kingdom and in front of a live audience at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. And it was organized by Rebecca Olds of Timesmith Dressmaking.
We have 8 people on our team. The dressmaking team is headed up by Abby Cox, Vice President of American Duchess. Abby has extensive experience in cutting and draping on the body with the 18th century dressmaking techniques. Lauren Stowell is founder and CEO of American Duchess and Royal Vintage. She's a very experienced historical costumer and researcher, and she's co-author of the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Dressmaking and the American Duchess Guide to 18th Century Beauty. Also on our team is Perrin Westerhoff-Nyman from Canada. She lives here in Edinburgh, is working on her PhD in Scottish dress history at the University of St Andrews. Katie Stockwell is a professional historical dressmaker and milliner specializing in Regency ladies' wear. Alexandra Bruce has just completed her BA honours degree in costume production from Rose Bruford College of Theatre and Performance. Georgia Goff is our model. She's a multi-period historical dressmaker and reenactor. And last but not least, Flora McLeod-Switlicki is our team PA, if you like.
Once we got to Edinburgh, before the 2 days of the project, we invited the team over to our little apartment to do a masterclass. We needed to roughly run through how this dress was going to be made, some of the quirks of it, so that on the day itself, there wasn't a mass confusion, terror, and chaos.
Yes, we were trying to prevent that from happening. The other thing that we did on Friday before the big event is we ended up cutting out the bodice shapes on Georgia in the privacy of our flat. We wanted to include it as a part of the program, but unfortunately with our time restrictions within the program itself, I knew from my experience that it just wasn't going to be a feasible option. So we ended up just doing that in the privacy of our own flat. And that way it also helped us to see where any potential quirks or issues could arise on Georgia as an individual person. Because when you're dealing with a mix of a reproduction and a recreation, you have to find that balance within the modern human body, who is completely unique from Isabella, but then trying to honor the design choices that were made in Isabella's original gown.
Day one. Straight into the museum, straight into cutting things out. The first thing that we cut out were the skirt panels. Easy, right?
Yeah.
The interesting thing about hard tartan is that when it comes off the loom, there is no other process. It doesn't go through walking, it's not tentered. And so the plaid, especially when it's a large set like the Isabella MacTavish Fraser one, it's very noticeably a little bit off grain, and it has to be stretched back into position.
So this is one of the issues that Claire was facing during the weaving of this fabric, is that even though she's using antique looms, they're still 19th century looms. They're still mechanical looms. They're not the hand looms of the 18th century. And so they're much more aggressive in the weaving process. That's actually why the plaid just got ever so slightly skewed, which meant that we had to attempt to tenter
it back into position
ourselves.
This is one of my favorite memories from the entire project. The first day, there's Perrin and there's Katie, and they've got one corner each, and they're pulling and yanking on this big panel to like get it back into position.
Because we didn't think about that taking up time.
And it really did.
And
like yanking this to get it, because otherwise nothing you lay out, none of the pattern that you lay out is going to have the landmarks that you need. This was actually the first time we were cutting the actual tartan rather than our test fabric, which was just a plain solid wool.
Yeah.
And we discovered all kinds of interesting cutting choices that the original mantua makers made.
Some of them were very economical and very interesting and thoughtful. You learned a lot in the why they cut things the way they did, but it was not nearly as straightforward as what you would have thought it would have been. The sleeves
in particular, and also the bodice fronts. The tartan is a very, very big set. It's a big, bold pattern. So you don't have a lot of room for squidging around on making a decision where you're going to put things. You have to get it in the right place. So you have a big blue square and you have a big green square. You have this triple stripe, and you've got to get it on the right place on the arm or the right place on the bodice. That took so much time.
Oh my God.
We had the iPad out, looking at the photographs, trying to figure out, okay, what square, color square, and where's the stripe on the sleeve? How does it line up? This took a long time and a lot of brain power to figure out.
It took a lot longer than
we
what
thought
we ever would have budgeted. When you look at the gowns side by side, I am really proud of how well we did with our pattern matching.
We'll never know why this gown was cut on the straight the way that it was.
No. At this point in time, when Isabella was getting married, it's 1785, and the stay shapes at that point in time in history are very curvy, they're very thrusty. And so cutting a gown on the straight at the front with that kind of thrusty shape to the stays is not a good idea.
It may have been that the mantua maker was like, ooh, nice selvages, don't mind if I do.
Yeah.
But what happened is exactly what we thought was going to happen, which is those straight panels in a fabric that is not stretchy, cut on straight of grain, produced a rumpled front.
Yes, and the lacing did not help the situation either.
I think the lacing strips were solving one problem, but then it caused another.
Yes.
When we fit the gown the first time, doing the fronts to the backs, we didn't have the lacing strips put in. We just had it pinned at center front, and it looked great.
Yeah, nice and smooth.
Looked beautiful. But the fabric is so heavy,
Oh,
the hard tartan, with all of this bulk around the waist, that it pulled the back of the gown bodice away from the body. So they used the lacing strips to pull that in, but that produced this extra going on at the front.
Oh man, that gown was heavy.
It was so heavy. Once we got all the skirt on there, I think the thing must have weighed like 20 pounds.
At least 20 pounds. This thing weighed a ton. And it took more than one person to do a fitting on it. Like, so at one point, there's footage that I'm trying to fit the front of the gown, and you're just holding
I've got the skirt.
The skirts.
When you put the skirt panels on to the back, because this is an English style pleated back gown, there's a weak point created after you make the scary cut.
Very scary cut.
And then you've got like 10 pounds and 10 pounds of skirt pleated ready to fit on the body. And if you let that go, it could just rip the entire skirt off the back of the bodice. We replicated the back pleats exactly to the original dress. But unfortunately what that meant is that we were not going to be able to get the shoulder straps into the exact position because our model had a different shoulder width than Isabella originally did.
What we ended up doing was we opted to match the original gown, and then we dealt with the shoulder straps not matching on the model.
It's sad that we had to do that, because that is one of the most interesting parts of the gown for me, is how those pleats and the shoulder straps intersect. But unfortunately, when it's a recreation and not a replica, you have to make those difficult choices. And we tried to honor the way that the mantua maker would have solved that problem as well. All told, we had about 13, 14 hours across 2 days to do this project, which puts an extra challenge on top of an already difficult project.
Yeah. From my previous experience working in a gown in the day, gown in a weekend kind of format, I had a really good understanding of what points we had to hit at what time to be able to complete the gown. Unfortunately, with challenges that we could not have anticipated, like pattern matching and the heat in that space.
It was extraordinarily hot.
Because of the time with cutting out that bodice.
And tentering.
We were basically 30 minutes behind. Yeah, everyone was sewing at speed.
But all told, we did get the gown done.
Yes.
It was a real push at the end. We did get the gown done, and were able to dash across to Greyfriars Abbey and do the final photo shoot. And yeah, we did it.
What started off as a dream for Rebecca Olds quickly became a mission not so impossible for her international team. Together, we were able to display historically accurate dressmaking techniques, as well as tell the story of Isabella MacTavish Fraser's wedding gown and the women who made it for her. We hope you enjoyed coming along this journey with us as we recreated the Isabella MacTavish Fraser wedding gown, and we hope you learned as much as we did in this recreation process.